The 1919 Washington, D.C. race riot reveals the dangerous intersection of racial prejudice and political power, showing us that when hatred is legitimized by those in authority, it can erupt into violence that devastates communities. This tragic chapter in history teaches us that true progress in race relations and politics requires not just addressing the symptoms of inequality, but dismantling the very structures that allow such injustices to persist. In the summer of 1919, Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, became another flashpoint for racial tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of American society. This period, later dubbed the Red Summer, saw a series of violent racial confrontations across the United States. The riot in Washington, D.C. was particularly significant because it unfolded in the very heart of American democracy, reflecting the deep-seated racial divides and injustices that permeated the nation. The root causes of the Washington, D.C. riot were multifaceted and deeply entrenched in the social and economic fabric of the time. Following World War I, a significant number of African American soldiers returned home with heightened expectations for equality and civil rights, having served their country bravely on the battlefields of Europe. However, they were met with the harsh reality that the same racial discrimination and segregation they had hoped to escape still gripped the United States. The promise of a better life and equal treatment remained unfulfilled, leading to growing frustration and a sense of betrayal among Black veterans and their communities. Simultaneously, the Great Migration had seen millions of African Americans move from the rural South to urban centers in the North and Midwest, including Washington, D.C. This migration was driven by the search for better economic opportunities and an escape from the oppressive Jim Crow laws of the South. However, the influx of Black residents into northern cities created increased competition for jobs and housing, stoking racial animosities. Economic instability in the post-war period further exacerbated these tensions. As the nation grappled with unemployment and economic downturn, competition for scarce resources intensified. The racial prejudices were fueled by white supremacist propaganda, which portrayed African Americans as a threat to social order and economic stability. Inflammatory articles in newspapers and racist rhetoric from politicians amplified these fears, creating a volatile atmosphere ripe for conflict. The immediate catalyst for the Washington, D.C. riot was a rumor that spread like wildfire through the city. Reports emerged of a white woman being assaulted by a Black man, a narrative that played directly into racist fears and stereotypes. Newspapers such as the Washington Post published sensational and often unverified stories about Black men attacking white women, further inflaming racial tensions. The media's role in stoking the fires of racial animosity cannot be understated. Their irresponsible journalism created an environment where violence seemed not only inevitable, but justified in the minds of many white residents. On the evening of July 19, 1919, the city erupted into chaos. White mobs, including civilians and military personnel, such as soldiers and sailors, began roaming the streets, attacking Black individuals they encountered. The mobs, fueled by incendiary media reports and a sense of vigilante justice, sought to assert white dominance and protect what they saw as the sanctity of white womanhood. The violence quickly escalated, and the mobs targeted predominantly Black neighborhoods, wreaking havoc and spreading terror. As the night progressed, the Black community, realizing that law enforcement was either unwilling or unable to protect them, began to arm themselves in self-defense. African American residents, many of whom were veterans familiar with combat, organized to defend their homes and families. The violence spiraled into a series of brutal clashes between the white mobs and and the black defenders, with gunfire echoing through the streets and bloodshed marking the nation's capital. One of the significant areas of conflict was U Street and the Shaw neighborhood, which were predominantly black communities. These neighborhoods became battlegrounds, with black residents barricading their homes and taking up arms to fend off the attackers. The violence was indiscriminate and brutal, with both black and white individuals being injured or killed in the melee. The exact number of casualties remains uncertain, but reports indicate that around 15 people were killed and dozens were injured, the majority of them African American. Law enforcement's response to the riot was mixed and often inadequate. In many instances, the police were overwhelmed and unable to control the violence. This lack of effective intervention further emboldened the rioters and deepened the sense of abandonment felt by the black community. Among those caught in the violence were numerous unnamed African American citizens who suffered injuries or lost their lives. For instance, a 17-year-old African American youth named Randall Neal was beaten by a white mob and later succumbed to his injuries. These individual stories, though often lost in the broader narrative, highlight the personal tragedies that defined the Washington, D.C. riot. The riot eventually subsided after several days of intense violence, but the aftermath left deep scars on the city and its residents. The immediate consequences were stark: numerous deaths, widespread injuries, and significant property damage, particularly to black-owned businesses and homes. The economic impact on the black community was severe, as many lost their livelihoods and homes in the destruction. The long-term effects of the Washington, D.C. riot were profound and far-reaching. The riot underscored the pervasive racial inequalities and injustices that plagued American society. It highlighted the urgent need for civil rights and social reforms, although meaningful policy changes were slow to materialize in the immediate aftermath. The violence of the Red Summer, including the events in Washington, D.C., galvanized the civil rights movement, providing a stark reminder of the need for organized resistance and legal challenges to systemic racism. The Washington, D.C. riot was part of a broader pattern of racial violence during the Red Summer, which saw similar riots in cities across the country. Each riot had its unique triggers and dynamics, but they all shared common underlying causes: racial tensions exacerbated by economic instability, the Great Migration, and pervasive racial prejudices. In Chicago, for instance, the riot was sparked by the drowning of a black teenager, Eugene Williams, who was stoned by white beachgoers for crossing an unofficial segregation line. This incident ignited a week of violence that resulted in 38 deaths and over 500 injuries, highlighting the extreme racial segregation and violent enforcement of these boundaries. In Omaha, Nebraska, the riot began after a black man, Will Brown, was accused of raping a white woman. A white mob stormed the courthouse where Brown was held, eventually lynching him, burning his body, and hanging it from a lamppost. The Omaha riot reflected the pervasive racial prejudices and the willingness of white mobs to bypass the legal system to exact their form of justice. The Elaine Massacre in Arkansas was one of the deadliest racial conflicts of the Red Summer. It began when black sharecroppers met to organize for better pay and were attacked by white vigilantes. The violence escalated, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 100 to 240 black individuals. The massacre exposed the brutal economic exploitation and violent repression faced by black agricultural workers in the South. The cumulative effect of these riots was to underscore the systemic racism and violence that African Americans faced across the United States. The Red Summer played a crucial role in the development of the civil rights movement. Activists like James Weldon Johnson of the NAACP documented the violence and used it to raise awareness and mobilize support for civil rights. The events of 1919 highlighted the need for organized resistance and legal challenges to systemic racism. The legacy of the Red Summer had significant long-term impacts on minority political involvement in America. The widespread violence and the failure of authorities to protect Black communities underscored the systemic racism embedded in American society. These events galvanized the civil rights movement and highlighted the urgent need for political and social reforms. The violence of the Red Summer and the subsequent implementation of Jim Crow laws effectively disenfranchised Black voters across the South. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory measures were used to systematically strip African Americans of their voting rights. This disenfranchisement had devastating effects on minority political involvement, effectively excluding African Americans from the political process for decades. The Red Summer also played a crucial role in the development of the civil rights movement. Activists like James Weldon Johnson documented the violence and used it to raise awareness and mobilize support for civil rights. The events of 1919 highlighted the need for organized resistance and legal challenges to systemic racism. The violence and injustices of 1919 were later cited as evidence in the push for landmark civil rights legislation in the 1950s and 1960s, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The legacy of the Red Summer underscores the importance of vigilance and advocacy within Black communities and among civil rights organizations. The need to protect civil rights and address racial injustices became a central focus of African American political and social life. The events of 1919 served as a stark reminder of the lengths to which white supremacists would go to maintain power and control, reinforcing the urgency of the fight for equality and justice. In contemporary American society, the legacy of the Washington, D.C. riot and the Red Summer continues. The events of 1919 serve as a reminder of the deep-seated racial inequalities that persist and the ongoing struggle for civil rights and justice. In recent years, there has been a growing recognition of the importance of acknowledging and educating about the events of the Red Summer. Historical research, public discussions, and educational programs have aimed to bring the truth of these events to light and promote understanding and reconciliation. The issues highlighted by the Red Summer, including systemic racism and racial violence, remain relevant today. The Black Lives Matter movement and other contemporary civil rights efforts continue to address these issues, advocating for justice, equality, and police reform. The legacy of the Red Summer underscores the importance of policy and legal reforms to address racial inequalities. Efforts to reform the criminal justice system, protect voting rights, and promote economic equity are ongoing, reflecting the lessons learned from the past. Commemorating the victims and events of the Red Summer is an essential part of healing and moving forward. Memorials, historical markers, and public commemorations help to honor those who suffered and ensure that these events are not forgotten. By acknowledging this dark chapter in history and continuing the fight for equality and justice, we can work towards a more equitable and inclusive future. The Washington, D.C. riot of 1919 and the broader Red Summer were significant and tragic events in American history. They exposed the deep racial divides and systemic injustices that plagued the nation and had lasting impacts on minority political involvement and civil rights. Understanding these events and their legacy is crucial to addressing the ongoing challenges of racial inequality and injustice in contemporary society. By acknowledging this dark chapter in history and continuing the fight for equality and justice, we can work towards a more equitable and inclusive future. The lessons of the Red Summer remind us of the importance of vigilance, advocacy, and the ongoing struggle for civil rights in the United States. The fight for civil rights is not over, and the events of 1919 serve as a reminder of the progress that has been made and the work that still needs to be done. The legacy of the Red Summer is a call to action, a reminder that the struggle for equality and justice is ongoing and that we must remain vigilant and committed to creating a more just and equitable society.